Going live now. So this is an hour-long Q&A. I've done 2 of these so far, and people seem to enjoy them. So let's get right into it. I've taken a bunch of questions pre-screened, and we're also looking at questions that you guys are submitting on Instagram. So I'll start out with the first one, and I'm sorry again that YouTube isn't working, but that is okay. We are working with what we have. So, what is the simplest explanation to why Trump has made large gains with Black and Latino voters? So this is one of the huge and somewhat ignored stories of the past. Really, it's only been reported on well in the past 2 weeks or so. There was first the 538 article, which found that Trump's support in the Black community had doubled in the past 4 years. It looks like the information we have right now from exit polls shows that his support among Black women has doubled from 4 to 8%, and his support among Black men has gone from something like 13 to 18%. And this is an interesting trend for a few reasons. The first is that it flies in the face of the narrative that Trump, the best way to view Trump is as a racist and a white supremacist who has been horrible for Black people as a result of his racism. At minimum, it throws an arrow in that narrative to explain why it is that Trump has gained support in the Black community in the past 4 years. Now, there are a few explanations that might account for it. One could be that a lot of, and this is by the way, this is a younger Black trend. This is a trend that has been especially present for younger Black men in particular and younger Black folks in general. This is not something that's happening with Black voters 40 and up. So there's a generational component to explain about why Trump has more Black support. And there's also just the time component. What's different about 2020 compared to 2016? So right off the bat, this is something where people need to do serious sociological research. All I can give you is the sum of my research and my gut instincts on why this trend might be the case. My sense is that Trump today is the same person he was in 2016, and frankly, the same person he was in 1996. So if something has changed with regard to his popularity among Black people in the past 4 years, it's probably not the result of anything that he did, right? He had the First Step Act, which was progressive on criminal justice policy. He had widely publicized criminal justice, released people from prison with Kim Kardashian and so on and so forth. And that obviously could not have possibly hurt his image with Black voters. At the same time, I don't think this is about policy. I think this is about a backlash to the larger cultural trends of woke anti-racism that have been sweeping the nation really in the past 6 years, and particularly in the past 4 years. There's lots of data on this now. Matt Iglesias has called it the Great Awakening. I think it's something people don't even really need data on because it's so obvious if you're paying any attention to the culture. But there's been a huge swing on the left in the direction of woke, critical race theory, anti-racism, which says that all Black people are victims of racism by definition. And I think that is a message that many Black people like myself, many of whom didn't necessarily grow up conservative or with conservative predilections, it's a message that many Black people recoil at. And it also makes sense that it's a younger Black trend because the youngest generation of Black Americans is the generation that has encountered the least amount of racism. There are some folks who say we make no progress, but I think most people who have some common sense understand that we've made an enormous amount of progress on racism. To be born in 1996, as I was, is a completely different experience than even my father having been born in 1964. And it's not to say there is no racism, it's to say that the average Black person, regardless of what you're hearing from pundits at the New York Times, is not dealing with jogging while Black. Okay, that's not, again, you can cherry pick, we can talk about Ahmaud Arbery and other isolated tragedies, but you can't simply extrapolate from a single story to a grand narrative. And I think a lot of Black people are increasingly seeing how toxic that narrative is. And so the swing in the direction of Trump may just be a response, not to anything Trump has done well, but a backlash against the wider trends on the cultural left. So let's go to the next question. Who are the authors that coined the term structural/systemic racism? So I've talked about this before. The authors that coined the concept of systemic racism were Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton. They wrote a book in 1967 called Black Power, which was the manifesto of the Black Power movement. And they came up with this idea of institutional racism, which they saw as an improvement or a distinction in different types of racism. They said you have individual racism on the one hand, which is a white supremacist or a KKK person coming up to me and calling me the N-word. And then you have this other thing that's a bit more nebulous, less violent, but still potent, which is, say I'm a Black person and I want to buy an apartment, but the real estate agent will only show me certain apartments, won't show me apartments in areas that are upscale and white. A loan shark refusing to give a loan or giving a predatory loan to a Black person where they would have done something different to a white person. This is what they meant by institutional racism, if you go back and read that book. What's interesting is how that term has expanded to mean, in essence, any departure from perfect equality of outcome between Black people and white people. So now if you ask someone to prove that systemic racism exists, what they will give you is a list of statistics showing that Black people are 14% of the population, but more or less than 14% of X, where X could be the incarcerated population, X amount of the wealth, X amount of income. And this is viewed as on its face, evidence of systemic racism. Because if we didn't have a systemically racist society, wouldn't Black people make up, as 14% of the population, 14% of all of the good and bad statistics that we would expect? Now, there's a very deep problem with that line of thinking, which is that there are many, many reasons why two different groups of people might not have identical outcomes. One of those reasons is racial discrimination, subtle discrimination of the kind that Stokely Carmichael was talking about in Black Power, which he called systemic racism. But there are 10 other, perhaps hundreds of other causes of disparity that many researchers and definitely journalists and pundits do no work to rule out. So if you forget for the moment about African Americans and focus on white people and Asians, you find all manner of disparities between those groups. And if you want to get more deeply into it, go back and look at statistics on the Polish and the Irish and the Italians as opposed to the Norwegians. You find massive disparities in criminal activity, in income. And these are all different kinds of white people. They're of the same race. And the same is true with Asians today. You have, this is an umbrella term that outlives its usefulness very quickly in these conversations. But to compare the average income of a Taiwanese American to a Hmong American you'll find as big a wealth and income disparity as you'll find between any two races. And the reasons for those disparities cannot be assumed to be racial discrimination, whether that's overt discrimination of the kind we would all agree is racist, or subtle racial discrimination. And so when we're looking at this, really the best way, the most convincing way to demonstrate racism is to do these audit studies where you send someone an identical resume with a black sounding name and a white sounding name and notice the different rates of response. And people do these studies, and that's a rigorous randomized test that answers the degree to which people have and are acting upon racial biases. And those consistently find that white sounding names tend to get the most response, and Hispanic and black sounding names get less responses. Sometimes those things find that Asians get less response as well, which again confuses the whole picture, because if the theory is discrimination is what's behind all disparities, then you would assume that Asian sounding names would get just as much a response, right? There's a lot of data on this, and I don't want to pretend that I can summarize all of it in one sentence. But the key thing to realize is that every multi-ethnic society in the world has had disparities. And often those disparities are precisely the kind that could not possibly be explained by systemic racism. There's no plausible explanation for why Jewish Americans have, higher than average incomes, higher than average wealth, that locates their success in some kind of discrimination in their favor. That's just not plausible given how much discrimination Jews have faced historically. And that's just one example, right? We can talk about the success of Nigerian and Ghanaian Americans in America, and especially in Britain. And so the point is not that there's no racism, and it's not that racism hasn't harmed Black people. The point is that if you're looking at some large disparity, there could be 10 reasons why this disparity exists, and racism could be accounting for 5 or 10% of it. And yet we just make this reflexive jump to call it racism, and therefore to equalize the outcomes, regardless of what the consequences are. And to give a recent example of what the consequences can be, this is not merely a point about getting things right as a matter of intellectual honesty. It's that when you don't get things right, that inevitably has consequences in the real world, because you're no longer in touch with reality. So for example, the San Diego school system has now said that because there's a grade gap between Black students and white students that has been persistent over the course of decades, and because we know that gap can only possibly be the result of systemic racism, we're going to get rid of grades. We're going to get rid of the system that is indicating that Black students are underachieving relative to white students. Rather than address the underlying causes, rather than say, well, let's do our best to help Black students be better prepared and turn in their homework on time, the idea is we can fix this problem by getting rid of the signal of the problem, right? Getting rid of curing the symptom of the problem while pretending we've cured its cause. That's the kind of policy which makes absolutely no sense, does nothing for Black people, could end up harming Black kids in the sense that it gets rid of the urgency to fix the underlying problem if it looks like there is no problem, because you've gotten rid of the thing that we use to measure the problem. And then somehow says that this is all fighting white supremacy, right? It doesn't make any sense. And I would bet that if you polled the parents of Black students in San Diego, do you think we should get rid of grades? I don't know. I have to imagine a majority would not be in favor of it. But of course, the people who are in favor of it are an activist elite that seems huge, but is not actually very large. And in fact, this is always a good thing to remind people of, is that something like 20% of Americans are on Twitter to begin with. And then something like 90% of political tweets are written by 10% of that 20% on Twitter, right? So 2% of the American population accounts for some 90% of any tweets you're seeing about politics. So, and this is the 2% of people that think Latinx is a real word, right? Go up to any Spanish-speaking person in New York City. I could go up to Spanish-speaking people for hours, asking them if they use or have heard of the word Latinx, and it will be hours before I find one. And that one will likely be somebody I went to Columbia with, right? Polls have shown something like 1 or 2% of Spanish speakers use the word Latinx. It's a horrible word that's made up. But this is a word you see regularly in the New York Times, in the nation's top media outlets. You hear politicians running for president saying this made-up word that no Spanish person actually uses. And what this is just a measure of how deeply in a bubble people are. And I'm not immune from this. We live in a massive country of 350 million people. And it's very difficult not to be in a bubble or to actually successfully correct for the bubble that you're inevitably in. So the 2% of people that are going to support the kinds of policies that they're now putting into place in San Diego, they are going to claim to speak for Black people, and it's not really going to matter whether they do. Every poll, every time the Black community is polled about these issues, you find 60 and 70% of Black people saying, no, we don't want less police, we want more police and better police. Yet defund the police is represented as the viewpoint of the Black community, right? And this goes back to the first question about why Trump has seemed to gain support in the Black community over the past 4 years, right? I saw Charles Blow tweet, the New York Times columnist, that he's devastated. He feels betrayed by his people, right? Okay, have your feelings. But when you get surprised by something big in the world, what a smart person does is they say, holy shit, something about my model of the world was wrong, or else I wouldn't have been surprised so deeply by this. So what I would urge people on the left to do now is to reevaluate the model of the world that thought it was completely obvious that a Black person could never vote for Trump, or that Trump could never gain support in the Black community. And it won't suffice to say that Black Trump voters are brainwashed, or these are the easy explanations that allow you to preserve your false model of the world. What you actually should do as an intellectually curious person is say, what was I wrong? What assumptions was I wrong about? Maybe you're wrong about the assumption that Black Lives Matter style woke anti-racism is something that Black people are so enthused about that if you just crank the dial to 10 on it, as has happened in the past year, that there'll be no backlash. Next question. Are you concerned about the self-fulfilling prophecy in the Black community where children grow up hearing nothing but negativity about their perceived place in the world, being told they're essentially screwed no matter what they do? I'm not actually sure how many Black kids growing up are going to hear the message that they can't do it and actually internalize that. It's something the reason I'm not worried about it is because it goes so against human nature. And this also connects to why Trump might be gaining more Black support. A lot of Black people, a lot of people in general, don't really want to hear the message that society is holding them down when it's not clear that that's true in their personal life, right? People, well-adjusted people tend to want to break down barriers they tend to be people that don't complain very much. And we all know this from our personal lives. We all can think of the friend that, no matter what happens to him or her, always seems to have a positive outlook, takes responsibility for their failures instantly. And that person is amazing to be around. That person is well-adjusted and trustworthy and likely to be successful. And I mean, most Black people I know fall into that category. So a message that tells them, you are a victim of racism. You experience racism every day. Racism is a crushing force that if you overcome it, it's like winning the lottery, and it can't be viewed as a trend. There's a lot of Black people, and I do think probably it skews male, that don't see very much inspiring in that message. They see it as disempowering. And if it were true, if it were 1940 and those things were true, then I would say it doesn't matter, because the truth is more important than anything. But it's 2020. And I think people are ready to call the bluff on the idea that systemic racism is this ever-present crushing force. I think most people understand it's a touch more complicated than that. So I don't think that it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think, if anything, the more that narrative gets pushed, the more there will probably be a backlash. Can you explain your view of the fundamental role of government in our society? Based on that, what national government programs are necessary? What are some good and bad examples that demonstrate your view? So, I mean, that's a huge question. I think one of my favorite thinkers is Tyler Cowen, who's an economist at George Mason University, who I all recommend you follow. He has a great blog called Marginal Revolution. And he's someone who was something of a libertarian, but he made a post several months back about something he called state capacity libertarianism, which is a kind of awkward name. But basically what it means is a philosophy that understands the value of markets in creating wealth. The fact that we can even have a conversation about wealth inequality in America means that we have enough wealth to worry about who gets what amount of it. And the engine of that wealth is capitalism and markets. But at the same time, there are some things that we just do need governments to do. For example, COVID-19, right? Our government at every level has failed pretty spectacularly. And it's not just our government, it's many governments around the world. But our inability to very quickly get things done that the market isn't going to do, like widespread contact tracing or something like that. Cowen's basic point here is that, yes, libertarianism has very important points to make about the centrality of markets for creating wealth, but we need a new version of it that accounts for the fact that there's problems in the modern world that we need governments to be the wind at the back of things like nuclear energy and pandemic prevention, for example. This is not something that the market is going to naturally do necessarily. So it's just a kind of acknowledgement of markets that also allows for a role of government, but not an expansive role of government, not a careless expansion of the welfare state that limits growth. The whole thing is a negotiation. There's having a safety net for people who can't take care of themselves, people who can't get a job because no one in the private market can pay them to do anything, whether it's because they're mentally ill or because they have personality disorders, or because whatever the reason. There's some people that are unemployable and they shouldn't starve, right? So that should be on the government. Outside of that, there's a negotiation between the welfare state and growth. There can be a trade-off where the bigger you make the welfare state, the less the economy grows over the long run and the less wealth there is 50 and 100 years from now. Which is not to say every welfare program decreases growth. I think it's all about the specifics of each program. So that's my basic outlook on how quote unquote big the government should be. Okay. So here's another question. Has Kendi responded? This refers to my invitation to Ibram X. Kendi to have a conversation about his book and about our general disagreements about race and racism in America. As most of you will probably know, Kendi is a writer, commentator on race issues whose book has been on the New York Times bestsellers list for many, many weeks and has been held up as the answer to American racial woes at this moment. And I think many people have pointed out that they've never really seen him have a conversation with someone who he disagrees with or who presses him on his thesis. And I've read the book closely, and I've read his other work, and I have lots of disagreements with him, and they're disagreements that are not peculiar to him and myself, but disagreements that are being had all over the country with people talking about these issues. So it would, either you think a public exchange of ideas is a useful thing, or you don't, right? Either you think the Baldwin-Buckley debate was a good thing for the public to see, or you don't. And I've always been the kind of person who does. I think, the cliche of the marketplace of ideas only works if you can ultimately, bounce ideas off of one another in real time. So I've invited him to have this conversation, and I wanted to connect it to a cause that both Ibram and I could feel good about. So we raised money, both as an indication of how much interest there is in the conversation and just to do a good thing for the hell of it, for the United Negro College Fund, which just gives out scholarships every year. And so far I haven't heard back, but I do know behind the scenes there are some organizations that neutral organizations that also want to see this conversation happen. So I would not count it out yet. I'm cautiously optimistic, and I think it would be a very good thing for the world. A point you've made repeatedly in response to the Kendi school of thought on racism and anti-racism is that disparities between groups are historically the norm. I'm wondering, doesn't this seem like the social Darwinist version of the naturalistic fallacy? Can't I agree that racial disparity is to be expected and believe that we should fight vociferously against it? If this is a coherent position, do you disagree with it? And if so, why? Okay, so this person is referring to the naturalistic fallacy, which is basically the argument that X is natural, therefore X is good. And that's a well-known fallacy because malaria is perfectly natural and all of the other horrible scourges of nature are perfectly natural, but not necessarily good. So this person is saying, sure, I understand that disparities are the norm wherever you go, whether it's between the Polish and the Irish or between Jamaicans and Haitians and Asians and whites. But just because it's natural, that doesn't mean it's good, right? And that is true. The point I'm making is about what is causing disparities. So if it's the case that a disparity between, say, Black kids, white kids, and Asian kids, an educational disparity is a straightforward result of how much those kids are studying in their households, then you can, the way that you combat that has implications for the way you would combat the disparity. You would not combat the disparity by railing against racism and white supremacy. You would combat the disparity by trying to give Black kids more resources and more, by drilling them and to study more, right? Whatever that means, however that can happen. It's of course a tough thing because so much is controlled in the home, and schools and governments can't merely, come into somebody's home and tell them how to parent their kids any more than any more than governments could, if they wanted to, make, you know, stereotypical tiger moms be less over their kid's shoulder, right? A lot of this is out of the control of bureaucratic, governments, and is in the control of local cultures and communities and specific households. So if you do admit that it's totally natural for groups with different cultures to succeed, to excel in different pursuits on the average, then the cause of those gaps gives you the solution, right? And so if we're going to say the cause of everything is racism, then that points to the San Diego school system solution of abolishing race-neutral metrics like grades and saying, well, the system must be racist, so get rid of the system. But if it's the case, and there's data on this, Brookings has done data on this, that the average number of hours studied in Black households is less than white households, which is less than Asian households, then that points the way to a different set of solutions. And it also points to the problem not being narrowly one of racism and white supremacy. So you can fight vociferously against that. You can be very, very motivated to do, work at a local school that has an after-school program for Black kids, for example. That's perfectly coherent with my view of what has caused that disparity. But it's still important. It's not the naturalistic fallacy per se. It's about what causes something and the causation pointing to a different solution. Do you think welfare helps or enables? I think clearly it does both. Like I said before, we need a welfare state. There's no capitalist society in the world that has managed to get into the 21st century without a welfare state. Now, you can argue that the voluntary welfare organizations of the 20th century or the 19th century were superior. I've read compelling accounts of that. That doesn't mean if we gut the welfare state today that what replaced it in terms of volunteer organizations would necessarily be enough, because the country is very different. Urbanization, people don't live in small towns as much as they used to. More and more people live in anonymous cities where there isn't that sort of high trust community that can just swoop in to take care of someone who can't take care of themselves. So we need a welfare state. Then the question is, does that have drawbacks for certain people? Yes, I mean, my mother used to tell me growing up in the South Bronx that when the welfare person came around, it's cliche because it's true, that you only got the check if there was no man in the house. And so either the man would hide or the man would leave. And that creates a set of incentives that is not functional, right? So then the next question is, does that account for the entire trend of fatherlessness in the Black community? I'm not sure that it does. I think it's more complicated than that. I don't think you can just pay a community to break up a family. I think the reasons people form families go deeper than mere financial incentives, probably. But I've also met people who grew up on welfare and who saw mothers handing welfare checks to their sons and daughters, and felt understandably that there was something really corrosive about the culture of getting used to welfare. So it seems to me all of those things can be true at the same time. It's true that we need a welfare state, that we can't just gut it as if that's going to solve a problem that it might have helped create, but also that welfare, like almost any social program, has drawbacks and consequences that should be acknowledged openly. Okay. Do you think a Biden presidency helping traditional liberals on the left will help give traditional liberals on the left more room to push back against overstepping from illiberal progressives. Yes, I do. I think that there's a kind of the past 4 years, I think a lot of liberals have felt like it's a choice between woke and grab him by the pussy. Kids in cages, Mexicans are rapists. Like, they felt that it's a choice between those two. And because it's a choice between those two, because Trump, whatever you want to say about him, is boorish and can be cruel and can be a bully in a way that no other Republican major contender has been, that it makes it hard for someone in the middle, given that choice, to really say no to woke or to spend lots of time criticizing woke, right? I think of someone like Yasha Monk, for example, a great writer at The Atlantic who is a liberal, pretty much wrote the book on right-wing populism before anyone had predicted Trump, really, but is also very much anti-woke. Someone like him has a harder job in a Trump presidency than in a Biden presidency, because under a Biden presidency, he has more time and energy to devote to criticizing woke social justice left without feeling that he has to balance every criticism with it, but Trump is worse. And without feeling that by criticizing the social justice left, that he's aligning himself with Trump, right? If Trump is the face of anti-wokeness, I would argue that's a very good thing for wokeness. Right? As a movement, you want to have an enemy that is careless, right? And you don't want to have an enemy that's dignified and careful, because that makes you look worse by comparison. So I do think liberals will have an easier time pushing back against woke ideas if Biden ends up winning things. How big a phenomenon that is sort of anyone's guess, but I think people should not count that out as a consequence of Biden's potential victory. This is from Matthew. I often hear that high rates of maternal mortality among Black women are caused by, quote, racism in the medical system. This claim seems to suggest that racist nurses and physicians are purposely mistreating Black women, causing their deaths in higher numbers. This is hard to believe. Are you aware of the possible causes of this disparity? Yeah, this goes back to our earlier conversation about the causes of disparities. The first thing to realize about maternal mortality rates is that we're talking about a difference between Black and white women that is either at the second decimal point or beyond. So that means 99.99% of women survive pregnancy. The quote unquote huge disparity we're talking about is all after that decimal place. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Obviously, every woman who dies in pregnancy is an incalculable loss to her family and to her. But what we're talking about, if you look over the past 100 years, is a problem that we've almost completely eliminated. Right? If you go back to 1900, women routinely died in pregnancy of every race, and we've basically eliminated this problem almost entirely. And in the ninth inning of this problem, people swoop down with articles in the New York Times about the disparity in the third decimal point between Black women and white women. I think this is a great example of Tocqueville's point that he makes of democracy in America, which is that as things become more equal in a society, the remaining inequalities become less tolerable to people. It's kind of a paradox. But as things equalize, as more and more people are brought into the fold of full citizenship, whatever small inequalities, tiniest inequalities remain, actually become magnified and create more anger than much larger inequalities did in the past. So when it comes to why such a disparity could exist, again, the research here is incredibly sloppy, and there are all kinds of, reasons why two populations that have different cultures, live in different places, would have different medical outcomes. Why do white people die more of liver cancer? I don't know, but that's a fact. If you go and look at the CDC sheet, all you're going to see is disparities, and they go every which way. Black people are more likely to die of certain things. White people are more likely to die of, other things, and all of this stuff is incredibly complicated, right? This is, it's a PhD thesis level question to answer any one of these. So to just look at a disparity and say it must be racism is the height of ignorance. And it commits you to very bizarre conclusions about why all the diseases that white people are more likely to die from, like liver cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and many others. Right? Are those racism too, or is it more? Is it not, as I said, a touch more complicated? Okay. Can you explain your understanding of equality of outcome and equality of opportunity? Yeah, so I think Ezra Klein has made a good point in the past, although I have much to disagree with how he thinks about this issue, that equality of opportunity is a little bit of a misnomer, because you actually can't guarantee people have the same opportunities, really. How could you really, in a deep sense, guarantee that someone like me, who grew up with parents who had means, had money, in a nice town with very little crime, also a very diverse town that exposed me to lots of different kinds of people, and then a kid who had a natural predilection for school and for learning and for staying out of trouble, how can you guarantee that I have the same opportunities even in life than someone like my mom, for example, who grew up in the chaotic South Bronx in the 60s? What you really can do is ensure that people are judged on their merits. That's not the same as having the same opportunities in life. By the way, the point I'm making right now, and this is not a point Ezra Klein would make, but a point that someone like Thomas Sowell would make, is that it's completely utopian and naive to think that you could possibly equalize opportunity. That doesn't mean, you should proceed from what you can do to what you should do, not decide what you should do and then wonder whether you can do it. The question is, what can a group of government bureaucrats do? They can't do that much, right? But they can do something. They can't save the world. They can't cure poverty. But let's look at the set of things that they can do, which is, for example, ensure that if I send my application somewhere, that I'm not judged on the basis of my race. That's something that's actually within their purview. So it's not an argument that we shouldn't equalize opportunity. It's an argument that we should do what is possible. And if we try to do what's impossible, you end up creating lots of harms. So the thing about equality of outcome, on the other hand, is that it is sort of well-defined, but it's also an incoherent concept. What would you even equalize, right? Why equalize blacks and whites? Why do we choose those categories as opposed to equalizing, Jamaicans and Haitians? Jamaicans and Ghanaians in this country don't have the same outcomes. You could equalize blacks and whites and still, you would have all kinds of disparities just because of the arbitrary ways that you choose to, put circles around groups, put labels on groups. So that's also not a very well-defined concept. But even if it were, The desire for equality of outcome is synonymous with a desire for tyranny. You can either live with disparity or you can try to crush it by force. And actually look at what that means, right? The whole point of the civil rights movement was, and people don't really like going back and reading what folks actually wrote, but you go back and read what Martin Luther King wrote, what Bayard Rustin wrote. The point was, yes, I'm black, but please just give me a fair chance. Give me a fair chance. I don't need anything more than a fair chance to prove to you that I'm qualified for this or that profession. All I need you to do is to stop discriminating against me on the basis of my race. Right? And that's what was located as the evil. The true evil of racism is that you look at me, you see my skin color, and you deem me unfit for something just on account of that. It's insane and it's evil, right? So look at what we're doing right now to Asians in elite universities, right? It's you're Asian, you apply to this school, and your odds of getting in, just because of the fact of your Asianness, instantly go down, right? People are in the very awkward position of explaining why that's totally okay, but the civil rights movement still had it right. And, I'm trying to keep my beliefs coherent. Which means, yes, I think the civil rights movement had the right idea. But what that commits me to is to actually take seriously the idea that Asians suffer from the kind of racial discrimination worth caring about when applying to Ivy League schools, for example. So what equality of outcome means is, by definition, discriminating against some people as a matter of policy in the name of some abstract ideal, right? And so it all sounds very good because you're not really paying attention and focusing in on the harms that you're causing. It's about whose voice gets promoted and whose voice doesn't. A few years ago in the New York Times, they wrote an editorial, very bizarre editorial, about the system of elite high schools in New York, which have operated for a very long time on a single test, completely meritocratic, and used to have a lot of Black and Hispanic kids back when my mom went to Stuyvesant in the 70s and 80s. But today, very few Blacks and Hispanics, and tons of Asians. And what the New York Times editorial said was that many of these Asian kids in New York, and I never forget the quote, scrimp on essentials like food to pay for test prep. That's what the New York Times says. And then it goes on in the same article to talk about how Asians must have some kind of privilege to be getting in. It's completely schizophrenic, okay? How could it be the case that the kind of world Martin Luther King was dreaming about was a world in which we said to an Asian kid that had a light dinner because they're saving money to get into a school, we're going to penalize you when you try to apply to Harvard? I don't see, there's no justification for that. And there's also, there's very little of the whole empathy machine that is put on board to affect people's opinions about issues where Black people disproportionately suffer is completely non-existent in this case, right? Where are the 3 or 4 minute Vox videos from telling it from an Asian immigrant's perspective, right? Where are the documentaries? They're out there a little bit, but they don't get nearly as much play as, any issue relating to a Black person suffering. There's a huge empathy gap, and And just the struggle to have a coherent set of principles is difficult to maintain in the face of the constant shifting and opportunism and coming up with arguments that make no sense. And to actually be a person of principle who says racial discrimination is bad in all cases becomes difficult in this kind of culture. When people will discriminate for whatever latest, faddish reason seems good to them. Okay. If Kanye had a real chance, would you have voted for him? If so, why? So, I did not vote for him. But let me say this. I was recently in a very, very good documentary, a short 17-minute documentary, which I recommend you all see if you haven't, called Crazy, Kanye West's Bid for President. I think it's something like that. It's a documentary by Rob Montz, in which he tries to, and he interviewed myself and Glenn Lowry and one other person, kind of steel man the case for Kanye. Is Kanye crazy? Is Kanye dismissible as a pure case of mental illness that we don't have to listen to anything he says? And the documentary makes a pretty good case that the answer is no. And I've long thought that Kanye's admiration for Trump had less to do with Trump's policies than to do with the fact that Trump did something that the world said he couldn't, right? He was laughed at the dinner with Obama, the White House Correspondents' Dinner. He was, a laughingstock of the mainstream media, and then he took Obama's job. And Kanye resonates with that because the world told him he couldn't rap when he was a producer. The world told him he couldn't do fashion when he was a rapper. And he's the kind of person, and one of the aspects I find inspiring about him is that when the world tells him he can't do something, he goes out and he does it. And I think that's inspiring to a lot of people. And so his presidential bid, the thing is, he does struggle with a mental illness. He was diagnosed bipolar, and he calls that his superpower, and I think probably has some kind of connection to his creativity, but he can sound very lucid sometimes. He can make perfect sense for 20 minutes at a time on Joe Rogan's podcast, but then he can appear to say something very crazy to me. So, in that sense, he is Trump-like. I'm not sure that he has persuaded me as a voter that he would be a better candidate than a Joe Biden, for instance. And I think he would have a lot of work he would have to do a lot of work to persuade people that he was serious and that he was competent. I don't think we should just fall into this habit of letting people who've never done the job do it because we're so sick of how phony politicians are. I understand that urge, and frankly, I laughed when Trump made fun of Biden at the last debate for being so politician-y. But that's not really an argument. That's a style point, right? At the end of the day, we need competent politicians, and he hasn't proved to me yet that he would be competent. Let me take one last question, and then we'll be out. This is from Kyle. What do you believe it will take for local and state officials to prioritize reducing the cost of crime, which arguably exacerbates economic inequality and reduces the possibility of human flourishing, instead of pandering to activists? This is a tough question because two things are happening at once. There are, politicians still win in this country at the local and state level on law and order platforms. Law and order is, perennially popular, but especially popular in places where the cost of crime is visible to people. So it's not that every state and local official around the country is trying to pander to Black Lives Matter right now. Although there are serious high-profile instances of that happening, such as in Minneapolis. And then if you go out to Seattle and Portland, it's all hell breaks loose. And it's as if they only care what the Black Lives Matter activists think, who are not themselves going to be suffering the consequences of crime. I think we just have to have an honest conversation about the cost of crime. And one thing that prevents this is that people become so nervous acknowledging the racial disparities of crime. People, and I understand this, the heart rate increases when you begin to talk about the fact that 50% of homicides are committed and suffered by Black people. But that's the fact. And if we actually want to begin dealing with the consequences of violent crime, not just for the victims of violent crime, but for the property values in neighborhoods that suffer violent crime, right? I'm hearing a lot of talk about Black wealth and the wealth gap, but very little talk about the fact that crime is one of the most important things, in addition to rioting, that decreases property values for Black people for decades in some cases. So if we can have a full conversation about the consequences of crime and about how to lower it in a way that doesn't just go back to the failed tough on crime policies of the 90s, we know now that locking someone up for 50 years, doesn't create 50 times more deterrence than locking them up for 1 year. So it's not that we need to go back to the failed policies of the past. It's that we need to have a very serious conversation about how to reduce violent crime, about what to do with drugs, about whether to decriminalize, legalize. There are a lot of tough, counterintuitive problems to solve. But I think in general, we shouldn't lump together policing and incarceration either, right? More police need not necessarily lead to more people in prison, right? So these are related but separate conversations about how to reduce crime for people, which is a problem that Black people suffer disproportionately. When Gallup polls people about how concerned you are about crime, you find Black people, on average, more concerned, not less concerned than white people, right? And as I said before, you get 60, 70% of Black people polling that they want more police, not less, but better police, reformed police. So I would say we obviously the activists have an agenda and have virtually no idea what they're talking about when it comes to crime. But I think we just have to insist on pointing to the failures of the activist position on crime, which, Minneapolis and the Chaz zone are two great examples. In Minneapolis now, residents are suing the city asking for more cops, where after George Floyd, the city council said they're going to dismantle, defund. So, the shocker there is that the people that have always needed the police still need the police. So we just have to point out the consequences of these bad ideas and insist that we not keep repeating the same mistakes in the headiness of the moment of the revolution, essentially. Okay, so that'll be my last question. Again, I hope some of the people from the failed YouTube stream made it over to Instagram. If not, I'm sorry. Thank you for your continuing support. I'll plan to do more Q&As and make sure the technical issues are all ironed out. And if you like what I'm doing, you can support me at ColemanHughes.org. Thank you so much for your support.